Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Chapel of the Holy Spirit. My name is Colin Petramali, and I'm the coordinator of community partnerships here at Sacred Heart University, representing the Office of Mission, which includes volunteer programs and service learning and campus ministry here at Sacred Heart University. We'd like to first not only extend a warm welcome to our friends here in this chapel, we'd also like to extend a welcome to those of us who are watching on live stream. We hope that this time with Father Dan Horan will be life-giving for each of you and an invitation to further conversation. As we've been getting to know Father Dan for the past little while that we've spent with him tonight, one thing stuck out to me in particular, that sometimes we can be very Christian without being very Christ-like. And sometimes we can be very Catholic without being very Christ-like. I believe what Father Dan, in talking about laying the foundations for an anti-racist spirituality, what Father Dan is hoping to do tonight is to invite us to the former, invite us to being a bit more Christ-like in a way that isn't always comfortable, but is nevertheless necessary for us to learn how to live with one another in the 21st century. And for us to learn how to recognize how our brothers and sisters and our non-binary friends are suffering in this world and how we can be of support to them. So with that, I'd like to just briefly introduce Father Dan. He made sure that I would not read all the names of the books because I don't know if he's afraid it may bore people. So Father Dan Horan is a Franciscan friar, a professor of philosophy, religious studies, and theology, and the director of the Center for Spirituality at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana. He is also affiliated professor of spirituality at the Oblate School of Theology in San Antonio, Texas. He informed us today that not only is he a columnist for National Catholic Reporter, a favorite of our office, but also he has handed in a paper tonight for them to post on Thursday in their online newspaper. He, as I mentioned, did not want me to name his books, but trust that he has written many of them. He's done a lot of research in his PhD, and we cannot wait to hear what Father Dan has to share with us tonight. Let's give him a round of applause and welcome.
Thank you so much, Colin. And he lived up to the promise. I said, keep it short, whatever you do, keep it short. Let me begin by extending my thanks to Sacred Heart University, to the President's Office, especially to the Office for Mission, that extended this really kind invitation for me to be with you today, both in person and, of course, for those joining us virtually. I want to especially thank Father Tony and Paul, who used to work in the office, and a tremendous note of thanks to Amy, who is the coordinator extraordinaire. For those at home, she's getting applause, rightfully earned. I also want to thank the campus ministry staff. I got to spend some time with a number of you earlier today, as Colin alluded a minute ago, and it's been delightful. Tonight's topic, I'm used to using slides, and I'm not actually regretting that I don't have them because the space of the Chapel of the Holy Spirit is so gorgeous. So if you find me very boring and monotonous and you need to zone out, you can enter into some prayerful meditation, and that's okay. But I hope you do stay with me as much as possible. The topic of tonight's presentation is titled Understanding the Impacts of Whiteness, Developing a Spirituality of Anti-Racism, laying down this foundation for us, particularly when I say us, I'm talking about those who look like me, and I'll say more about that in a minute, who occupy social locations like mine, more to come, to think about how better to integrate some of the questions and challenges of our time into our life. I want to begin first by saying that I have a method to the madness, a kind of strategy that comes to us from Pope John the 23rd. In his 1961 encyclical letter, Mater et Magistra, Mother and Teacher, he lays out a methodology for how Christians in general might think about putting what it is they believe into practice. And he includes this threefold process that is commonplace to many of us today, known as see, judge, and act. If you're familiar with Catholic social teaching or community organizing, you may be familiar with that. And so I want to begin by talking about seeing the signs of our times. In recent years, we've witnessed a formidable legislative backlash to the increased attention to racial injustice and the persistent effects of American white supremacy that has surfaced in the digital age. For example, we saw early last year the newly elected Virginia governor issue an executive order on his very first day in office that forbids the teaching of, and I quote, inherently divisive concepts, including critical race theory in schools. Not long after that, in Florida, the governor advanced a bill there that, and I quote, would prohibit Florida's public schools and private businesses from making people feel discomfort or guilt based on their race, sex, or nation of origin. And it's now making its way through the state legislature. In my own home state of Indiana, House Bill 1134 sought to impose a similar moratorium on discussion of any historical facts that may cause racial discomfort or guilt in Hoosier schools. The bill passed the state house last February before being stopped in the Senate, though there are legislators in Indiana who are vowing to reintroduce key elements of the bill. Virginia, Florida, and Indiana are not the only places seeking to pass these kinds of laws. As of this moment, there are 44 states with similar laws on the books or proposed legislation in the works. What is really motivating this action is a desire to dampen or to silence genuine truth-telling, historical analysis, and engagement with the complexity of our collective and individual pasts and contexts, which includes the persistence of systemic racism in a society that views whiteness as supreme. The crusades against anti-racist pedagogy, resources, and knowledge more broadly have nothing to do with education. As my colleague, the philosopher Dr. Drew Pierce once keenly noted, it has everything to do with politics. He explained that these political efforts are aimed at, and I quote him, shaping a generation of students to remain in the dark about our country's legacy of racial injustice and thus remain amenable to a politically motivated, racially regressive platform. Recourse to the legal system is not a new tactic for the social, economic, and political bolstering of white people in the U.S. Beginning with the oppression and genocide of Native North American peoples and the introduction of chattel slavery in the 17th century up and through the Jim Crow era, explicit legal privileges and protections were granted to those who were identified as white in America. From the mid-20th century onward, due to signature Supreme Court decisions, it was no longer acceptable or technically speaking legal to enshrine anti-black racist laws at the local, state, and federal level. Therefore, as the philosopher Shannon Sullivan notes, when it became illegal to grant social, educational, financial, and other advantages to white people's racial advantages became more difficult to identify. Many white people thought that perhaps those advantages really had been eliminated, and the new laws were working to ensure equal opportunity no matter what one's race. However, as scholars, activists, and ordinary citizens alike have observed, there continues to exist a major disparity between the way that those identified as white are viewed, treated, and protected in the U.S. when compared with Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. This phenomenon is what has traditionally been described as white privilege. In short, to borrow a definition from the educator Francis Kendall, white privilege is an institutional rather than a personal or individual set of benefits granted to those of us who, by race, resemble the people who hold power positions in our institutions. One of the primary privileges is having greater access to power and resources than people of color do. In other words, purely on the basis of our skin color, doors are open to us that are not open to other people. I want to say that I recognize that the term white privilege has become a hot topic, a problematic issue in different circles and for different reasons over the years. There are some who wish to deny the reality of white privilege altogether. Those who tend to be predominantly of white populations refuse to accept their own racialization and the consequences, and indeed the benefits of being identified as white in a systemically racist society. These folks rest their objections with the premise itself. They don't believe it's real. There is a refusal to accept that certain benefits, advantages, or privileged treatment are bestowed on them, on people like me, historically and concurrently on account of our racial identity. Such folks, though not universally, are often the same people who decry reverse racism. How many people have heard this term before? Okay, good. I just want to remind the folks who are present here that you're not on Netflix. The folks streaming, I can't see them, but I can still see you. I want to make sure people are still awake, Folks who deny this reality commonly, if inaccurately, describe our society and our institutions as post-racist. And such folks frequently claim that any effort to dismantle or to correct for systemic racism is an affront to their own opportunities or freedoms. You might hear people say this, white people in particular. Why are we talking about this? You may be thinking about this yourself or have had friends or neighbors say, why is somebody talking about this? The presumption being that things have been resolved. Still, though, there are others, including some scholars and anti-racist activists, who have also raised questions about the language of white privilege as a useful term. In this group, nobody denies the phenomenon and the real-life realities that white privilege seeks to describe. However, recognizing the complexity of intersecting identities and constantly shifting social locations, especially when one considers factors like gender and class and sexual orientation and nation of origin and physical and mental ability and the like, has put focus on whether privilege as the operative descriptor is ultimately helpful or not. Poor whites, for example, struggle to accept the reality of racial privilege when economic and social oppression is a real force in their experience, even if they might benefit from being identified as white in a systematically racist society. One can likewise imagine the kind of defensive postures adopted by white transgender persons or white disabled persons, and so on. Recent work like that of the philosopher Shannon Sullivan on what she calls white priority attempts to introduce a different kind of language to get at the same idea, the heart of that phenomenon. White priority, I think, speaks for itself and doesn't emphasize a kind of where's my benefit privilege in the same, for some, confusing way. The key thing is whatever we end up calling this, it is the other side of the coin of systematic or systemic racism that we're witnessing today, especially white people with political power, to the growing social awareness of racial injustice in this country. This is a way to describe what's going on. Many white people cannot stand to reckon with the truth that such injustices have and continue to exist, and that the history, the perception, and memory of the world as they want to recount it is in so many ways false. This visceral reaction that some white folks have ranges from what sociologist Robin DiAngelo calls white fragility to what the historian Carol Anderson names white rage. This is fueling this push we see among the many in our society, especially those who draft and approve laws, to once again codify the supremacy of whiteness into American law. The tenor of that proposed legislation across the country is one of censure, of silence, of erasure, of denial. It is a rejection, I would say, of reality. And it has one purpose: to shield white people, especially white students, from facing difficult truths about our own whiteness and the impacts of whiteness on themselves and others. This evening, I want to look at what's being denied here, to shine a light on it, to look at it without fear. I want to state from the outset that I recognize that my social location and its impacts are important. I am a white, cisgender male, Roman Catholic religious and ordained priest. I'm a tenured university professor with U.S. citizenship. I sit at the intersection of tremendous privilege, as do many others here who are identified by one or many of those categories. It's not my intention tonight to speak on behalf of any community especially those of minoritized groups. I recognize that my responsibility is in part to address people who look like me and occupy similar social locations, though it is my hope that what I share can also resonate with the experiences and observations of others. Rather than contribute to what I believe is social injustice and sin, in the complicity of willful ignorance, that desire, that impulse to not want to know, I just don't want to know about this, and the false indignation in the face of those truths of our shared past and present, I invite us, I pray that we can look squarely at what so many white people are trying to deny and erase today. To do this, I'm going to present this in 3 parts. First, I want to talk about what it means to be white. Second, I want to highlight some of the impacts of whiteness in society. And third, I wish to identify a few suggestions for white folks like me in moving forward as people of faith to develop an anti-racist spirituality. Does that sound good? It doesn't matter, we're doing it anyways. I only brought 1 set of notes. That never gets old, that's the teacher in me. The fellow teachers will understand. So first, what does it mean to be white? As I shared with some folks over dinner from the campus ministry and Office for Mission, white folks in predominantly white institutions and contexts rarely talk about race, except when there's a crisis. When something horrible has happened, somebody has been harmed, or they've been called out for racist attitudes, behaviors, microaggressions, and the like. Learning about whiteness can be a startling reality for many white people, because most of us white folks in the U.S. have been raised, socialized, taught, entertained, and informed by a system that casts doubt on the existence of whiteness as a racial category itself. And in the rare instance in which whiteness is acknowledged, white folks often deny that it has any meaningful significance. To learn about our assumed racial identity when so much effort and energy has gone into denying it, ignoring it, or explaining it away, is to risk encountering the many falsehoods that whites have taken for granted as truth. It means risking the discomfort of knowing what has been invisible to us, but plain to people of color. And it means to risk having to relearn a fair amount about reality and forego faulty assumptions about who we are and how we are in the world, marred by inescapable racism and white supremacy. I shared this with some folks earlier today, that education is always discomforting. You will be, especially if you're white like me, and even if you're not, uncomfortable probably tonight. I want to name that. I want you to accept that and be ready for it. I'm not trying to trick you. It's not a surprise. Why? Because we're going to learn something, I hope. Here at an institution of higher education like Sacred Heart University, it's an institution of learning. The classroom is a place of discomfort. It's supposed to be. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because when you learn something, one of 2 things happens. You either learn something you didn't know, and in the process, your ignorance is exposed. If you didn't know something, then you realize, oh my gosh, I've been living my whole life up to this point with that gap in my knowledge. Or you're confronted with having to relearn something you thought you knew. I thought this was the way it was, but actually in class, I learned something different. I think for many folks like me, what we're going to talk about tonight is going to be closer to that second point. We white folks are, at least at first, unreliable narrators about race. However, women and men of color have long attested to the painful truths of racism and privilege in a white supremacist culture and narrated accurately those basic aspects of what it means to be white within such a context. They can do this because their experience at nearly every point of navigating life is pervasive in a pervasively racist society is an experience of encountering subjugation, minimization, dismissal, and rejection, all against the contrast of whiteness presented as normative, which people of color have never had the privilege to overlook or ignore. When scholars and activists talk about the U.S. being a white supremacist nation, this is at the heart of that forceful yet true summation. Though many people assume white supremacist is a term reserved only for those who avowedly embrace the belief in a white racial superiority, like racism in general, the term white supremacy is far more nuanced. Because our American cultural context is one in which whiteness is presumed to be the default in all aspects of life, our society is fairly, rightly described as one that elevates those people and things associated with whiteness, while subordinating or denigrating those people or things associated with any other racial identity. Personally, I have learned and have been challenged by the insightful work of many people of color who are far more reliable narrators about whiteness than even the most self-critically aware white person. And I continue to learn and be humbled by my own ignorance and my deeply ingrained racism. To put it bluntly, most white people in the U.S. do not know who we are because, as the writer James Baldwin observed, whites typically live in an illusion of our own creation and support the perpetuation of the lie of neutrality, normalcy, and supremacy by means of opposition and othering. White identity is so often framed as, I am not X or I am not Y, and so on. According to this formulation, to ask, what does it mean to be white, leads to the inevitable, if unspoken, assumption it means to be not black. This is an instance of what scholars call social binaries, where individuals and groups form identities over against and in opposition to another group that is typically viewed by the dominant group as lesser than or inferior. This sort of dynamic is not limited to race as the only determining category, but also applies across a broad series of systemic oppressions. And each form of oppression has a title. Sometimes we talk about these as the isms, right? You've heard of this before, right? As legal scholar Harlan Dalton has summarized, race exists only in relation to one another. Whiteness is meaningless in the absence of blackness. The same holds in reverse. Moreover, race itself would be meaningless if it were not a fault line along which power, prestige, and respect are distributed. On this last point, it's worth noting that race is about meaning-making in the American context. It is, on the one hand, an arbitrary system of valuation tied to appearances and perceptions and external categories. This is what we mean when we say that race is a social construction. However, that system is entirely arbitrary. That is, it doesn't have any objective grounding in science or anything outside particular social contexts. It doesn't mean, however, that race is unimportant or irrelevant. Those two truths can be true at the same time. On the contrary, because we live in a society that places an immense amount of significance on race, it's extremely consequential for both those who benefit, typically whites in this context, and those who are harmed or often disadvantaged by the same system, blacks and people of color. As the philosopher Charles Mills explains, this racial dichotomization, that either or, that opposition, was not incidental. It was not just that rulers happened to be white and the subjugated happened to be non-white. Rather, race was absolutely central to the ideology of the period of the 18th through the 20th centuries. It was precisely because of alleged white superiority, he says, to other races that whites saw themselves as entitled to rule over others. The meaning assigned to skin color, or phenotype, right, how one appears, arose from a system of power, shaped in particular by the European colonization of what is today North America, beginning with the dislocation and genocide of indigenous peoples of this land and the emergence of the Atlantic slave trade. Just as the meaning of blackness, or to put it more bluntly, non-whiteness, developed and shifted in accordance with the historical circumstances of oppression and white supremacy over the last 4 centuries, so too did the meaning of whiteness, even if it was neither easily or deliberately recognized, and most white folk don't ever acknowledge or talk about it. Race is, as the renowned historian Nell Irvin Painter plainly states, an idea, not a fact, and its questions demand answers from the conceptual rather than the factual realm. To begin to understand what race is, one has to grapple with the history of a concept, an idea, and reckon with fluidity. She explains that constructions of whiteness have changed over time, shifting to accommodate the demands of social change. Various groups of European immigrants, Irish, both sides of my family come from Ireland, Eastern European Jews, Italians, and so on, were considered as embodying various degrees of whiteness which established a hierarchical casting of those who might today comfortably identify or be categorized as white, but who weren't throughout all of this nation's history. And that's important. How quickly people who are identified as white forget that some of your own ancestors, my own ancestors, would not have been classified or categorized or identified as white. That there has always been a shifting sense to the meaning of race highlights what we mean when we talk about race as a social construct. It is something not determined by objective fact, but by social declaration. Who gets the count as white? Whiteness is one among many socially constructed races in our American context, but for most of us white folks, we have been conditioned to view ourselves as non-racialized, and therefore normal, natural, or the default when viewing ourselves in relationship to others. Realizing the truth about the arbitrariness of racial classification and its lack of biological grounding helps us to see the world with greater clarity and nuance. If we white people allow ourselves to continue learning, over time our awareness of the meaning applied to and the consequences that arise from racial categorization will increase, and our ability to recognize the two-sided coin of racial injustice and privilege will improve. What follows then is the possibility of seeing what some of the impacts of whiteness are for both those who are and are not identified as white within our social context. So that's part one. Part two, what are the impacts then of this reality? In looking at some of the many impacts of whiteness in our society and church, I want to highlight just a few. Namely, that whiteness is viewed as normative, I mentioned that already. Whiteness is invisible, and whiteness is a form of property. All three of these offer a glimpse into impacts on white people and people of color collectively. So first, whiteness as normative. Because we live in a society in which whiteness is considered supreme, that is the default or normal or ideal, we can say that those who are identified as white and that which is understood as related to white culture or identity is considered to be normative or the standard. The dynamics are binary in that oppositional identity formation arises from society assigning meaning or assigning value to characteristics of a given racialized group. When whiteness is understood as normative or ideal or held as supreme, this does not merely mean that it is equally different or that equal differences apply to other groups, as if there were a binary but positive complementary meaning. Another way to describe that is separate but equal, right? It's not like they're different but on the same tier. Instead, as with all else in the two-sided coin of racial injustice, one category, one identity is valued positively or desirable while the other is valued negatively or often understood as undesirable. We see this play out in several ways when whiteness is the positively valued racial category, as is the case in this country and in our church and so many other institutions. For example, being identified as white means never having to think about one's racialized identity or self as part of a racial grouping. I can tell you that no one has ever asked me, Dan, what do white people think about X? I've never gotten that question. And I've been in places, many places, where I am the only white identified person. Conversely, being black in the same context often means having to be hyper-vigilant about real and perceived dynamics of whiteness in order to negotiate social settings, and sadly is also often a requirement for survival. For example, being identified as white means being the beneficiaries of a society that prioritizes one's comfort in a wide variety of contexts, especially when difficult topics, including introducing racial stress are discussed. Conversely, being black in the same context often means having one's feelings, history, and experience dismissed, denied, or erased, while never having one's comfort given social priority. I mentioned at the beginning of my talk all of these state legislatures introducing these comfort bills, right? Saying that we can't talk about our history of racism or indigenous genocide or so on and so forth because we don't want to make students uncomfortable. But as one black Washington Post columnist raised very directly the question, whose comfort are we talking about? What about the black students, the indigenous students, the Latinx students, the students of Asian descent, and so forth in the classroom? What about their discomfort in having their histories erased? Another example, being identified as white means almost always fitting in and having a sense of unearned belonging or entitlement to spaces and places. I can speak from experience. The combination of being a white male from the United States means that there's virtually no place on earth where I don't feel like I have a right to belong. That is not the experience for many folks who don't identify with one or more of those identities. But to put it in stark relief, conversely, being black in very similar contexts often means experiencing a palpable sense of alterity or otherness, of difference, while being perceived as a perennial outsider or other. I was in a panel a couple weeks ago, actually, not far from here, I'm realizing. Time flies, in Hartford at the University of St. Joseph. And one of the professors there is of Asian descent, and he talked about being the perennial foreigner and how he had had friends on the West Coast who had parents who came to the United States from East Asian countries generations ago, multiple generations ago, and how even all these generations later, when people ask, "Where are you from?" And the answer is San Francisco. And they're like, no, but where are your parents from? And they're like, San Francisco. What about your grandparents? They also are from San Francisco. You get the hint. But what is really being asked here? A perpetual alterity, otherness, foreignness, outsider status. Being identified as white means one's experience is presumed to be the baseline for normalcy, acceptability, and propriety. Conversely, being black in the same context often means frequently experiencing the devaluation of cultural and historical heritage, art and aesthetic preference, fashion and style choices. There's been so much conversation, and perhaps not enough, about boundaries and judgments and rules in workplaces and schools that are white-centric, about how people of color should present themselves or style themselves, how they should speak or what their hair should look like or what clothes they should wear. That's a form of what I'm talking about here. One more example, being identified as white means benefiting from widespread social presumptions of goodness and truthworthiness and competence, while conversely being black in the same context often results in unfounded presumptions of criminality or being perceived with suspicion. If you don't want to reflect on this, if you look like me, then let me speak for myself and say that I have been pulled over by the police before. I know it's a shock for a priest and for a Franciscan to be pulled over by the police. It's not happened often and has not happened for a long time, and I hope it doesn't happen ever again. But when it has, it's always been because I was speeding. But that's not the point. The point is that I have never had to think for myself, am I going to die right now? Because I was speeding or because I wasn't or whatever. No one's ever pulled me over for driving while white. Father Brian Massengale, who I'm going to invoke in a little bit as well, a theological ethicist and a priest, a professor at Fordham University, not far from here as well, has in his book, The Catholic Church and Racial Justice, has a very stark illustration of exactly this point. Back in 2005, when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans and there was great devastation, especially for the black population of that city, there was published 2 photographs of people, as there often were, in the newspaper when there's flooding, right? There's the Associated Press and there's the New York Times, and they're taking pictures. And at the same sort of store, people were walking. There were 2 pictures, a black man and a black woman, and in another picture, a white man and a white woman, both coming out of the same store, like a 7-Eleven or like a Kroger or a grocery store, a ShopRite, something like this, some store. Both sets of couples were carrying bags, holding them up because the water was chest high. The captions at the same place on the same day, the same time, read differently. Of the black couple, it said, I'm going to paraphrase here, here's a picture of 2 people looting a local store after Hurricane Katrina. And on the white people, it says, 2 people who found supplies at a local store after Hurricane Katrina. You can Google this, you can see these pictures side by side. It became a point of great study and conversation. But the point, this is, again, to illustrate for those who might doubt what I'm saying, that this is incredibly widespread and commonplace. So that when we talk about systemically racist or a white supremacist society, we're always already talking about a setting in which whiteness goes unquestioned as ideal, with the tragic consequence that otherness is always positioned oppositionally and negatively. So whiteness as normative. The second point, whiteness as invisible. White women and men like me do not generally talk about whiteness because the dynamics that make possible the burdening and oppression of people of color at the same time cover up the reality of whiteness as a racial marker within this web of relations. The philosopher Sarah Ahmed highlights that whites do not generally recognize whiteness because we are socialized to believe that our identities, perspectives, and cultures are simply the norm or the default. That is, they're the way things ought to be. She writes, it has become commonplace for whiteness to be represented as invisible, as the unseen or the unmarked or the non-color, the absent presence or the hidden referent, against which all other colors are measured as forms of deviance. As George Lipsitz explains, whiteness is everywhere in U.S. culture, but it is very hard to see, at least if you're white. For it is the unmarked category against which difference is constructed. Whiteness never has to speak its name, never has to acknowledge its rule as an organizing principle in social and cultural relations. The philosopher George Yancey, who, if you want one recommendation to read, I'd say Father Brian Massengale, but if you want two recommendations to read, Father Massengale and George Yancey. He writes that the socialization of whites into whiteness is not unlike the manner in which native English speakers learn to speak English. Think about this for a minute. He says one learns English in the context of the everyday by hearing it spoken, especially if English is your first language, right? The subject of the language learning process does not self-consciously incorporate the grammar of English, yet parents engage in correcting the linguistic performances of their children. This is part of what it means to inhabit a linguistic community. He says, likewise, white people inhabit a racialized community in which they become white through subtle, uncritical, and tacit socialization. At times, there are stronger signals sent to correct the racial grammar, he would put it, of white performance, but oftentimes it goes without saying. Now, that may seem abstract. I love the language analogy because I think about it. However you learn your first language, it's not with sitting down every morning as a 2-year-old in your family's kitchen with a chalkboard in your mom or your dad telling you to diagram sentences, conjugating verbs. That's how you learn another language, right? Nobody taught you English that way, or whatever your native language is. There are subtle corrections. A little 2-year-old runs up to a parent in the kitchen and says, "Daddy, me hungry." And the dad doesn't sit him down and say, "Okay, well, let's have this talk about how English works." Just simply says quickly, "I'm hungry." The subtle correction. Think about how this has worked in subtle ways in terms of racialization. Imagine a white mother and a white child walking down a city street. It could be New York, it could be Hartford, it could be New Haven, it could be Shelton. A white mother and a white child are holding hands, walking down a city street, and coming up the same side of the street and the opposite side, or facing them, is a young black man. The mother doesn't say a word to her daughter, doesn't cross the street, doesn't duck into a store, doesn't change any sort of behavior, except as the young man comes closer to them, she merely tightens her hand on her daughter's. The grip increases, never says a word. But what has been unspoken? What has been communicated? What has been taught? Because we white people have been formed to think of ourselves and our experiences as normative, it can be so difficult to see that truth. This is not the case for people of color who are continuously confronted with messages, both subtle and explicit, that they are not normal, they are different, they are other, or euphemistically, they are ethnic. I have a whole story about how my classmate in the Friars, when I was a postulant living in the Bronx, said to me at one point, "Dan, you're not ethnic." And I had no idea what he was talking about. He was talking about this. I can tell you it later if you want to hear that whole story. This dynamic is something that the scholar and the early civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois understood personally, and he understood it academically. Way back in 1903, 120 years ago, when he described the presence of what he calls double consciousness. The double consciousness that Black people experience when confronted with the structural, institutional, and historical realities of American racism and white normativity. He wrote, and I quote, "It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder." This sense of whiteness, meaning universal belonging or entitlement, is something that I've come to see with greater and greater clarity over time in my own life, and has helped me to reckon with the fact that we live in a white supremacist culture, which presumes that my whiteness is the norm, and those who look different from me are the exception or other. I see it in our institutions, in our schools, in our society, and even in our church. Living in a racist society not only champions those aspects of my cultural formation and worldview, my understanding of senses of beauty and forms of comfort, but also makes clear that anything that does not reflect or conform to those standard norms is viewed and treated as inferior or worthless. Scholars like the sociologist Joe Fegan have described this as the white racial frame. Fegan explains that the white racial frame is the dominant racial frame that has long legitimated, rationalized, motivated, and shaped racial oppression and inequality in this country. This white racial frame is a centuries-old worldview that has constantly involved a racial construction of societal reality by white Americans. This is part of what it means to talk about white privilege, namely that to be white in America is to be typically unaffected in any negative way from the presence of whiteness as the social and cultural norm in nearly all aspects of shared common life. So those are just some illustrations of impacts. The third thing, whiteness as property. In 1993, the legal scholar Cheryl Harris published an important article in the Harvard Law Review. She coined the phrase whiteness as property. Harris painstakingly demonstrated how the legal system in the U.S., from its very founding, established whiteness not only as a racial characteristic that distinguished some people from others in an arbitrary manner, but also as a traditional form of property that bestowed on individuals categorized as white certain rights and privileges. Furthermore, these advantages were identified with the white individual such that they were always present as our personal property. Harris explains, and I quote, "Whiteness defined the legal status of a person as slave or free. White identity conferred tangible and economically valuable benefits. It was jealously guarded as a valued possession, allowed only to those who met a strict standard of proof. Whiteness, the right to white identity is embraced by the law, is property if by property one means all of a person's legal rights." Like other kinds of property, whiteness accrues value over a lifetime. It's why there's not only income inequality across racial lines, but there is family and historical wealth inequality over generations. This is yet another way of talking about a kind of white privilege. As I mentioned earlier, the term can be somewhat misleading. Privilege would seem to suggest that white people should be able to recognize some concrete material benefits or at least not experience, for example, financial hardship. But life, particularly in a racist society, is neither that simple nor that easy. We are more than just our race. We are also gendered and abled and intellectually variant and have a range of financial resources. This realization that identity and social context is the result of multiple complex social and power disparities requires a complicated analysis that's sometimes called intersectionality. Because to understand a particular person's circumstances and their particular social location requires looking at the intersecting social structures and dynamics that shape their experience in the world. Still, that said, within a racist society, one's perceived race plays a disproportionate role. One only has to think, for example, of examples like that of former President Barack Obama or the renowned Harvard professor Henry Louis Gates Jr., both of whom are very successful and intelligent and powerful men. They benefit from male privilege, no question. They benefit from educational privilege, no question. They benefit from all kinds of power, especially when you're president of the United States. And yet both have experienced discrimination and racist vitriol because they are also black men in the United States. One, if you don't know the name Henry Louis Gates Jr. or Skip Gates, you may recall the instance of a Harvard professor being arrested trying to get into his own house. That was him. Conversely, and this is why this is important, the notion of property and what value is tied to racial categorization, that even the poorest, least educated, and otherwise socially disadvantaged white man will never have to endure the subtlest racial discrimination or the most overt racial animus on account of his race. The concept of whiteness as property articulates the material benefits that are collectively accrued to those identified as white in the U.S. One of the obvious impacts of this phenomenon arising from whiteness considered supreme is the foreclosure of similar benefits to those who are not identified as white. Over time, as I mentioned already, this results in generational and material inequality as well as persistent generational trauma. So my third and final part. I want to offer some suggestions for white folks like me in developing a spirituality of anti-racism, recognizing that we don't talk in predominantly white spaces and communities and institutions and churches about whiteness unless we confront a crisis. We've begun to do that, I hope, tonight, or at least are continuing that. We've looked at some of the impacts, how it manifests itself, what the implications are. So now, the so what, as people of faith. So I want to tie what I've presented so far to the theme of spirituality, namely addressing the soul sickness of racism. Expressed in this way, drawing from the description of the Fordham ethicist Father Brian Massengale I mentioned earlier, he coined this term several years ago. This statement recognizes that racism is more than just an individual or a social or an institutional or a political problem. Racism and its complement of white privilege are wisely likened to a spiritual illness. As Massengale explained in a 2014 talk, there are many ways to understand racism, namely as a political issue, as a sociological phenomenon, as a cultural divide. But for me, at its deepest level, racism is a soul sickness. It is a profound warping of the human spirit, one that enables human beings to create communities of cold, callous indifference to their darker sisters and brothers. Stripped to its core, racism is that disturbing interior disease that enables people to not care for those who don't look like them. In a 2021 presentation to the Carmelite community in Baltimore, Father Brian Massengale, a black Catholic priest, reflected on how he arrived at the coinage of this term, soul sickness. It's a long quote, but I want to share it. He says, "This phrasing, soul sickness, is one that I coined. The phrase came to me when I was sitting in an airport lounge watching news coverage of the St. Louis District Attorney's decision not to indict the police for the killing of Michael Brown in 2015. Brown's uncle was being interviewed on TV. He was distraught and overwhelmed with emotion, his angry sobs overtaking him as he lashed out at the failure of the system to obtain justice for his nephew. But as I watched the faces of the overwhelmingly white crowd who viewed the broadcast, I was the only black person in the area. I saw stony faces, hardened, impervious at the outpouring of grief. White faces fixed in anger at the indictment that was being leveled against American society. I was stunned. I wondered, what has so twisted the souls of these people that they are not only unmoved but hardened at the grief of someone who lost their young child? Would they be so calloused if this were a white young man whose death was being mourned? This is what led me to talk about white supremacy as soul sickness." Massengale goes on to note that, and I quote, "This soul sickness is a cultural reality. A culturally induced indifference leading to an unconscious refusal of empathy and concern." In discussing some of the impacts of whiteness, I hope to have highlighted some of the ways in which what is often experienced as invisible or not immediately consequential for those identified as white actually contributes to great harm and oppression of people of color. This should not be a surprise for those of us in the Catholic tradition, for we have always understood our sinful culpability beyond discrete and deliberate actions. We call this the sin of omission or sins of omission. You've heard this before, right? It's also described as the failure of what we ought to do. When people gather in this space on Sunday or Saturday evening for weekly liturgy, we pray, right? We acknowledge our sinfulness. We pray for what we have done, and we acknowledge what we have failed to do. For many white folks, the impacts of whiteness, especially the harmful consequences for others, are instances of the sin of omission, a failure to see clearly, to understand intentionally, to accept reality for what it is in all its unpleasant historical and contemporary truth, and then to do something about it. Likewise, in the Catholic tradition, we also understand one's life journey as ongoing, as something like a pilgrimage, a lifelong pilgrimage. It's not one and done. It's not this and we're over with it. It's ongoing conversion and growth. It's never too late. Reflecting on the soul sickness of racism and the religious and spiritual implications for white folks especially, I'm reminded of the work of the German theologian Johann Baptist Metz. In his book, Faith in History and Society, Metz describes two kinds of memories, human memories. The first, he says, is the sterilized form of memory, in which we just do not take the past seriously enough, and we recall everything in a soft, glowing light. This type of memory is usually evolutionary or progressive, reflecting a trajectory of history moving toward an increasingly better world. The other type of memory that Metz calls or describes is called dangerous memories, memories which make demands on us. This latter kind of memory are what he sees constituting the core of the Christian narrative when we take seriously the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Metz explains that these dangerous memories illuminate for a few moments with a harsh, steady light the questionable nature of things we have apparently come to terms with and show up the banality of our supposed realism. Far too often, the history of anti-Black racism in the United States is reduced to the sterile, cliched, and comforting former type of memory. The stark reality of indigenous genocide, of chattel slavery, of Jim Crow, of xenophobia, the continual destruction of Black lives, and our collective complicity in its perpetuation is reduced to a caricature. Think about it. Think about the way, for instance, in January when we celebrate Martin Luther King Day, or when in February, coincidentally the shortest month in the calendar, which is Black History Month. I'll let you sit on that for a minute and reflect on that. That the stories that are so often told, particularly in predominantly white spaces, are the reduced, traumatic for white folks, least discomforting stories. It's the friendly, nonviolent Martin Luther King Jr., without the radical call for conversion and social change that he actually preached. It's the simplistic recounting of the way things once were and how much better things are today. It's the false stories that get told and retold in that soft glow of pseudo-history. Alternatively, when it comes to our shared history of slavery in this country, we tell a similar sort of easy memory, a story about a triumphant work of the liberator, martyr Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War, which overshadows the complexity of a past marred by indescribable suffering. How often do we actually look squarely in the face of those memories? The memories of indescribable suffering of generations of persons that had been dehumanized. Human beings who had been sold and owned and raped and murdered and destroyed. Many whites who have the luxury to look away and forget those memories do so. This is a selective kind of memory that silences the oppressed, the victims, and the dead. This is a kind of memory that allows the sins of American racism and white privilege to continue today, an unquestioned status quo shielded by our willful ignorance and desire for historical progress. But systemic racism in all its forms is a memory of that latter kind that Metz talks about. It's a dangerous memory. It's like the resurrection of Christ, depicted here, by the way, which can never be separated from his life and death. You don't need to be raised from the dead if you haven't been killed in the first place. Ever think about that? There's something redeeming about the calling to mind the suffering caused by American slavery and its continuing effects. It's not to redeem or to erase or to mitigate the horror of the past. What is redemptive isn't the belief that all is okay now. Rather, the way toward redemption is directed by an awareness that things are still very far from okay. What makes the memory of American slavery so dangerous in Metz's phrasing is that in calling to mind the suffering of history's victims, we begin to see that the suffering continues today. Hope is found in the interruption that cries of Black Lives Matter, in the indisputable witness of horrific racialized murder in the case of somebody like Mr. George Floyd that make in our everyday lives and presumptions. What shocks our awareness? This interruption should shock us into hearing the muted cries of history's victims, like we see in Psalm 34 in the Bible, and recall that although we are many parts, we are one body in Christ, as St. Paul says to the Corinthians. White people like me have to work very hard to train our vision on the dangerous memories that tell the story of our collective history of racism and white supremacy, because the system is set up to shield us from seeing this truth. And so we need to continually lift the veil of willful ignorance. That's the very first step of laying the foundation of an anti-racist spirituality. It doesn't just happen because the system itself is designed to prevent us from seeing it. So I have 5 suggestions for fellow white folks like me interested in training one's sight on that truth in the spirit of Christian faithfulness and spirituality. The first is, let us not seek to preserve our racialized comfort over the discomforting facts of racial injustice that beckon our response. No more for willful ignorance. 2, we need to avoid defensiveness and the temptation to dismiss, minimize, or erase the real suffering experienced by those harmed by systemic racism. I hear it all the time. Some of you have heard it all the time. Some of you have even said it, I'm sure. I'm not a racist. I'm not a racist. Or I didn't mean that when called out on something. It almost doesn't matter what we describe it as. Oftentimes, I think people talk about microaggressions, right? It's a kind of a weird qualifier, right? Because anything that's aggressive or that causes harm is not good, whether it's micro or macro, you know. But as a white person who may be called out, especially called out in love for something that was not intended, but rather the impact was significant and harmful, what is our response? To get defensive? Well, I didn't mean it that way. That fails to recognize the difference between intention and impact. Third, let us recognize the impacts of whiteness. Recognize that it has taken a role as normative in our society, and that we need to call out, reject, and seek to dismantle such cultural and societal hegemony. Fourth, we need to open our eyes and ears and hearts to acknowledge that whiteness is a constructed racial identity that has tremendous impacts in our society and institutions, rather than to close ourselves off to allow for its continued invisibility. And fifth, to let us work to dismantle the proprietary character of whiteness in our context so that greater equity, justice, and peace may abound. Instead of getting defensive and protective and maintaining a kind of racialized comfort, let us be open to real relationship. While education and awareness are indeed important, it is necessary for us to recall that they are just the beginning. Response and action are what must follow from that. So how do we, especially white folks like me, pursue a spirituality of anti-racism? Here I want to draw from the wisdom of 2 Mennonite scholars, 2 Christians from a different tradition than my own. I'm a Catholic, as I mentioned. These scholars, Regina Stoltzfus and Tobin Shearer, provide us with a succinct description of what they mean by an anti-racist spirituality. They say an anti-racist spirituality is a way of being in the world that draws on the unknown and unknowable, which some call spirit, others name grace, goes by the word of mystery, relates to us as God, in order to encourage, empower, and enthuse amid the intention and action to undermine the systems of white supremacy around us. They further note that it fosters truth-telling, first to oneself and then to others. It lifts up communal efforts. It's not afraid of hard conversations. It invites laughter, joy, and human connection. And an anti-racist spirituality does not demand perfection. This last point is significant because of the inevitable stumbling blocks, uncertainty, missteps, and confusion that arise when folks, especially white folks, commit themselves to the work of addressing the soul sickness of racism. Reflecting on the significance of identity formation and how our respective social locations inform so much of each of our ways of being in the world, these authors talk about what churches and other faith communities, especially those that are predominantly white, need to do. They say that in order for faith communities to have genuine, sustained conversations about race, they must understand white supremacy and its effects, which have driven economics, politics, and other systems that Black people must encounter and navigate daily. Recognizing that the work of anti-racism is multidimensional, these authors note that it has at least three broad components. We need to bear witness. We need to foster justice. We need sustaining work for the long haul. For Christians, these three dimensions ought to be grounded in and supported by an ongoing recognition that the work that is done is not merely a social agenda, but it is also something that requires our attunement to the presence of God. We might ask ourselves, how does my prayer inform or is shaped by the call to work for racial justice? For those of us who preach in places like this, in what ways do I connect the good news, the gospel, that dangerous memory of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus to the reality of racial injustice in our own time? We might ask ourselves, where is God in the midst of my learning, my relearning and bearing witness? And what sort of examination of conscience can I make in order to reflect on the socialized racism in my own heart, in my own thoughts, in my own practices? To close, I know you've been very attentive late in the evening. The womanist theologian Kelly Brown Douglas wrote not long ago, "Just as white supremacy has not disappeared, neither has the religion that fosters and legitimizes it. As white supremacy has transformed itself throughout the nation's history to reflect the customs and constraints of the time, so too have white supremacist versions of Christianity. In our own time," she goes on, "these racist renderings of Christianity have simply adapted to 21st century cultural mores and political sensibilities, thereby manifesting in ways perhaps more subtle, but no less blatant." Echoing and building on the observations of her foremothers and forefathers who have long noted the role of Christianity as the conductor of white supremacy in this country, to borrow an image from the sociologist Robert Jones, Douglas reminds us of both white supremacy's insidiousness and its oftentimes hiddenness. She's not alone. Pope Francis has also drawn the church and world's attention to this dimension of soul sickness. He wrote in his 2020 encyclical letter, Fratelli Tutti, that, and I quote, "Racism is a virus that quickly mutates, and instead of disappearing, goes into hiding and lurks in waiting." As I've reiterated in this presentation, racism is more than just a social problem or a national issue or something for secular consideration. It is a spiritual disorder. It is what Father Massengale aptly calls soul sickness. My interest in offering these points of reflection tonight was to primarily address those fellow white people who aren't afraid to look at the difficult truth of our complicity in structures of systemic racism and white supremacy. I know it's not comfortable. That's the point. This is an invitation for us to continue, if not to continue, to at least begin laying down the foundations of an anti-racist spirituality, seeking renewal in heart and mind by means of reckoning with the reality and the impacts of whiteness. Christianity challenges all of us to penance, to growth, and to renewal on our spiritual journeys. That's especially important at this season of Lent. But for our spirituality to bear the characteristics of anti-racism, we white folks in particular must first begin to do the difficult work of lifelong learning, conversion, and action. Otherwise, although we may individually not commit discrete acts of racist violence, which is the lowest bar in trying to distinguish what is or isn't, quote, racist, we will nevertheless continue to reinforce distorted forms of Christian life through our sins of omission, which is our failure to know and to do the things that we ought. There is so much work to do, but let us do it together and work together into the future. Thank you. We have questions? I'm not sure if do we have questions? Time for questions? Or? I'm happy to take comments and questions. I know, that's right. I'm sorry for the folks streaming. Maybe you can leave comments or email questions if you'd like. Sure, first Jeff, and then there's a gentleman in the back there. Yeah.
Can you expand a little bit on the earlier part of your talk about the language? It was expressed as light priority compared to white privilege.
Yeah, so for those folks listening on the live stream, I'll just repeat quickly. The question was, could I expand on that earlier point about the language of white privilege and Shannon Sullivan's example of white priority? Just to say that what the phenomenon that the term white privilege is describing is an objective reality, right? But the term privilege has become really problematic. And so different scholars and anti-racist activists have been thinking about, okay, well, if people keep getting hung up on this notion of privilege, right? So like, for instance, poor whites might say, where's my white privilege? I can't make ends meet. I'm still struggling to survive. Or, that's just one example. The proposal is, are there other ways we can think about describing this phenomenon? That there are, benefits to, another way, this is something I'll use, and this is very embarrassing, to invoke one of my own proposals, which is the idea, the analogy or metaphor of a snowplow. Because part of what white privilege points to is the fact that there is a lot of experience in the world that folks identified as white in a racist society never have to deal with. So imagine, and we can here in Connecticut, imagine a huge snowstorm, and there's 2 lanes in the street. One lane has been plowed clear, and the other lane has 3 feet of snow. And people of color have to walk on the snow-filled side of the street, and white folks can walk on the plowed side of the street. You're all allowed to walk down the street, you're all moving in the same direction, but one is way harder, more difficult, more challenging, and more dangerous than the other. That's one way perhaps to think about the phenomena that's being described when we talk about white privilege. It's not necessarily things one gets, though that's also true, especially collectively and intergenerationally. Shannon Sullivan's point about white priority is, I think, well, it's a good image to describe a lot of the conversation going on right now. I think back again to that columnist from the Washington Post asking, when we talk about protecting the comfort of students in the classroom, whose comfort? Whose comfort is prioritized? Students of color, black students, Latinx students, students of Asian descent, or white students? What are we talking about here? So I think, I don't know if that answers your question exactly, but there have been some proposals of, okay, we're not denying that this phenomenon exists. And that's in contrast to some people who say white privilege isn't a real thing. You hear a lot of that today. White folks say this is all made up, this is all not true. It is true, but I'm sympathetic, like Sullivan and others are, to the fact that people can get hung up on the language of privilege. It makes you think like whites are getting a check in the mail every month that people of color are not getting or something. That's the way it's often presented. And you spend so much time trying to explain, well, that's not really what we mean by privilege, that's not what so this proposal of white priority or some other metaphors have been introduced. Yes, please. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate that, and I'll summarize just briefly for the folks might be streaming. This was more of a local connections and invitations that are being extended, invitations to relationship, invitations to additional programming. And so you see this gentleman here, he's got his brochures, come and see him afterwards. I may just take this opportunity to highlight, because the things that apply to all of us here, but also the folks who might be joining us remotely, that you lifted up some really important things. Relationship is important. The listening as a white person in this country, in this community, and also to focus on the locality. Sometimes, one of the things Pope Francis talks a lot about, he does this in Laudato Si on his encyclical about creation. He does it in Fratelli Tutti, which is about social relations, including racism, about politics and peacemaking. One of the things he says is that most people of goodwill are not actively sinning and causing harm and desire the harm of others. But the biggest problem that we have is the sin of indifference. People just don't care. They don't bother to care. I'm reminded of the Jesuit moral theologian James Keenan, who described sin once as the failure to bother to love. It's the not even getting to the point of caring. And so I appreciate what you're saying, is that there are many opportunities we can take. It doesn't have to be a mega thing, right? How do we solve, this is a huge societal, institutional, religious challenge, right? One among many, like global climate change. What can one person do? What Pope Francis says is most of us then just get overwhelmed, we shut down, and we do nothing. And what I hear in your invitation to the local community is you can do something. You can learn, you can listen, you can educate yourself. I appreciate the references to the books you're reading. There's a lot of information out there that just requires a little bit of effort. It's a start, it's something. And then one can build these relationships, build these communities, and we can work together for justice, inclusion, equity, and the like. So thank you, sir, for sharing that. And encourage those who are joining us remotely in their own locales and in their own lives to do exactly that. One other thing, it's not exactly something you said, but it's something I would like to highlight, which is just to lift up again one of the things I mentioned in my talk about white folks, and I'll speak from my own experience, as being unreliable narrators of the experience of race. My own racialization as a white person identified in this country, but also the experiences of others. I think it's incredibly important, whether interpersonally in real life, but also through reading, through movies, through documentaries, through study, through the courses you take, students here and those who may be joining us elsewhere, to listen and to not get defensive or dismissive or to outright avoid. That's a really important effort, and I hear from your sharing just a moment ago that that's been part of your own experience. Recognizing your own unreliable narratorness about your own experience requires moving outside one's comfort zones. I think that's incredibly important. Thank you for that. Any other comments or questions? I know it's late, and you've been very, very good to be here on a Tuesday night. Yes, please. Yeah. Such a great question. Thank you. I don't have all the answers, but I have maybe one suggestion or one framework to invite us to think about. For those listening online, the question was, how do you navigate, especially either, I'm going to kind of expand if it's okay, our experience, particularly white folks who might be called out in something that we did maybe ignorantly, unintentionally, that was harmful or perceived as racist in some manner or form, or how does one navigate calling out, as it were, others, right? When they will get defensive or don't want to engage. How do you navigate these things? This isn't a panacea. It's not a one-size-fits-all, but I find it very helpful. I found it personally for me because I continue to struggle with this too. I mean, part of the work of anti-racist scholarship and spirituality and activism is, especially for white folks, we're going to stumble and make mistakes. The whole system is designed for you to be oblivious to it. And so it's like a salmon upstream. You have got to be mindful of this, and you're not going to get everything right. The thing you can control is what you do in response in those moments. And the instinct will be to protect one's own ego and sense of goodness. There's a reason why white people in particular, hate the R word. They don't want to, I'm not racist. That's the response that often comes up because racist equals bad person. Racist is KKK, racist is neo-Nazis, racist is et cetera. To recognize, first of all, in oneself, that if you live in a racist society, are part of racist institutions, you are affected by and socialized in that setting. You can't escape it. And so to acknowledge that is a starting point. The other thing that I think is really important is that related but different realities of impact and intention. So I have found it helpful to remind myself, I didn't mean to is a way of saying I did not intend to cause harm. And there may be embarrassment or shame in the fact that you're upset. Nobody likes to make other people upset unless you're a sociopath, right? And so, it's like, think about your partners, think about your family members, your friends, your roommate here at school or whatever. When you don't intend to upset somebody, but they get offended or upset, you get defensive. That's, regardless, a natural mode. But to name that is actually, it turns the heat down a little bit in some cases. Some cases it won't, and we have to be ready for that. But to say, I know you didn't intend to do this, but this is how it came across. This is the impact. Or as an observer, to identify that same thing, to use that language is important because it helps to diffuse, in many cases, that gut reaction to be defensive, to say, you're calling me a bad person. You say, no. I know you didn't intend to do this, but this is how it impacted me. This is how it was perceived. This is how I saw it. This is how I've experienced it. It's that kind of counseling 101 I language that's really important, right? Because you're right, anything we can do to not be accusatory, that tends to just amplify things. So that I think that works both ways, right? It works when one is, to use yourself as an example, as the questioner, if you were observing this as a colleague, as an ally, as a third party to something that's going on, and to call that out, even the language of call that out sounds aggressive to a lot of folks, but we'll use it for lack of a better phrase. To use that language, I know you didn't intend this, but this is how I saw this. This is how I experienced that. And then when you're called out, to remember that yourself, right? That because the impact wasn't what you intended doesn't let you off the hook. And at the same time, it should help free us to hear the truth that's being offered to us. The last thing I'll say about that is it needs to be done in love. That's the spirituality of anti-racism here, right? I am saying this to you. I'm helping to call this to your attention because I love you, because I care about you, because I know this isn't what you intended. And I think that context makes a big difference. It doesn't solve all the problems, but it's a framework that I have found that's a starting point. And I am afraid we're at time, but I know there's some refreshments out here, so I'll stick around to chat with folks. I'll turn it back over here. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you everyone again, echoing Father Dan's sentiments for joining us tonight. And thank you to all those of you at home who stuck around for the entire session. And we hope that, as we mentioned at the beginning, that this was a life-giving and challenging talk for you, and that you will take these ideas and practices back to your community. Just wanted to quickly say about Father Dan that I think we've seen the best example of what prophetic preaching has to offer here tonight, which is really two things: naming the elephant in the room, and then also telling us what we don't want to hear. And I think we live in a world that too often where we go to places where people will tell us, whether it's the news that we watch, they'll tell us exactly what we want to hear. So we just want to give another round of applause for Father Dan. In waves of unearned privilege, we do have food for people who are here. For those of you at home, please send us your address. We will DoorDash you. We will have some leftovers, certainly, but for those of you who are here, we really want to encourage you to eat this food. Amy strongly wants to encourage you to eat this food, so please stick around. We'll have some time to chat with Father Dan, and thank you again for joining us tonight.